What's up, history buffs? Today we're diving into the question that would make your ancient history professor blush and change the subject. Messalina, the nymphomaniac empress who shocked Rome. And guys, when I say shocked, I mean she made Roman citizens, people who literally watched gladiators die for entertainment, clutch their pearls and whisper behind closed doors. Forget everything you think you know about Roman empresses, sitting around eating grapes and looking pretty. We're talking about a woman who turned the Imperial Palace into what can only be described as ancient Rome's version of a reality TV show, crossed with a scandal that would make TMZ executives weep tears of joy. Before we dive into this absolute train wreck of imperial ambition and sexual politics, smash that like button if you're ready for a story so wild that Netflix would reject the screenplay for being too unrealistic. And drop a comment. How far do you think someone would go for power? Because trust me, whatever number you're thinking, Messalina just laughed and said, "Hold my wine. Here's what we know for sure. Valeria Messalina became the third wife of Emperor Claudius when she was barely 20 years old. Claudius, for context, was about 50, had a stutter, walked with a limp, and was basically the guy nobody expected to become emperor. Picture the awkward uncle at family gatherings who suddenly inherits the family business, except the family business happens to be the Roman Empire. Now, marrying into the imperial family in ancient Rome wasn't like marrying into wealth today. We're talking about absolute power over millions of people, control of the world's largest military, and enough wealth to make Jeff Bezos look like he's shopping at a garage sale. But here's where our story gets interesting. Messalina didn't just want to be empress. She wanted to rewrite what being empress meant. Most Roman women, even powerful ones, were expected to stay in their lane. Manage the household, produce heirs, look dignified at public events, maybe poison a political rival or two if absolutely necessary. You know, standard empress duties. Messalina looked at this job description and basically said, "Yeah, that's cute, but I'm going to need you to add some things to this list." Within months of becoming empress, stories started circulating about Messalina that made seasoned Roman politicians do double takes. And remember, these are people who had seen emperors declare war on the ocean and appoint their horses to government positions. It took a lot to shock them. But here's what's really wild about this story. Messalina wasn't just some random woman causing scandal. She was operating at the very center of Roman power during one of the empire's most crucial periods. Every decision she made, every boundary she crossed, every norm she obliterated had consequences that rippled through the ancient world. The question we're going to answer today isn't just, was Messalina really as scandalous as history claims? It's, how did one woman's refusal to play by the rules nearly bring down the Roman Empire? Because, spoiler alert, she came a lot closer than your history textbook probably told you. Real talk. This next hour is going to sound absolutely bonkers, but every single thing I'm about to tell you is documented by multiple ancient historians. So buckle up, because we're about to witness what happens when unlimited power meets unlimited appetite, and the results are going to blow your mind. All right, everyone. Before we dive into the chaos, we need to understand exactly what Messalina was walking into when she became empress. Because calling her situation complicated would be like calling the Titanic's voyage slightly inconvenient. First, let's talk about Claudius, because understanding him is crucial to understanding how Messalina got away with, well, everything she got away with. Claudius was never supposed to be emperor. He was basically the spare to the spare to the spare. His own family considered him an embarrassment. They literally hid him from public view because they thought his disabilities made the family look weak. But here's the thing about being underestimated your entire life. It either breaks you or it makes you incredibly cunning. When Caligula was assassinated in 41 AD, the Praetorian Guard found Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace. Instead of killing him like they'd killed the rest of the imperial family, they decided to make him emperor. Why? Because they figured he'd be easy to control. Plot twist. They were wrong. Claudius turned out to be one of Rome's most effective administrators. He conquered Britain, built massive public works projects, and reformed the legal system. But, And this is a huge but. He was absolutely clueless when it came to managing his personal life. The man who could successfully govern an empire spanning 3 continents couldn't figure out that his wife was basically running a side business out of the Imperial palace. Now pause the video right now and guess what kind of side business I'm talking about. Whatever you're thinking, I guarantee it's not wild enough. Messalina came from serious Roman nobility. The Valerii were old money, the kind of family that traced their lineage back to the founding of Rome. She wasn't some social climber who married up. She was marrying across, trading her family's ancient prestige for current imperial power. This is important because it meant she had her own power base, her own connections, and her own ideas about how things should work. When they got married in 38 or 39 AD, Messalina was probably around 16 or 17. Claudius was pushing 50. Even by Roman standards, where political marriages between older men and teenage girls were common, this was a significant age gap. But age gaps in Roman politics weren't about romance. They were about creating alliances and producing heirs. And produce heirs she did. Messalina gave Claudius 2 children, Claudia Octavia and Britannicus. Having children, especially a son, didn't just secure her position as empress. It made her the mother of a potential future emperor. In Roman politics, that meant she was essentially holding the ultimate trump card. But here's where things get really interesting. Most Roman empresses used their position to accumulate wealth, influence family members into positions of power, or maybe commission some statues. Messalina looked at all these traditional empress activities and thought, that sounds boring as hell. Drop a comment right now. What do you think someone with unlimited power and unlimited resources would do if they decided traditional expectations didn't apply to them? Because whatever you're thinking, Messalina took it 10 steps further. By 40 AD, just a couple years into Claudius's reign, stories about Messalina were already circulating through Rome's social circles. And we're not talking about normal palace gossip. Oh, the empress wore a slightly inappropriate dress to a state dinner. We're talking about stories that made hardened Roman senators wonder if they were having fever dreams. The thing is, Rome in the 1st century AD was not a prudish society. This was a civilization where public bathhouses were co-ed, where sexuality was discussed openly, where the walls of Pompeii were covered with explicit graffiti. It took a lot to shock Romans when it came to sexual behavior. Messalina managed it. But here's what most people don't understand about her story. This wasn't just about sex. This was about power. Everything Messalina did, every boundary she crossed, every norm she obliterated was part of a larger strategy. She wasn't just indulging her appetites, she was systematically dismantling the traditional limits on imperial power. And for a while, it was working. Hold up. Before we continue, drop a comment if you think there's any limit to what someone would do when they realize nobody can stop them, because we're about to find out Messalina's answer to that question, and it's going to be a wild ride. So picture this. You're a wealthy Roman citizen in 41 AD. You've got a nice villa, some slaves, maybe you own a few shops in the Forum. Life is good. Then you hear a rumor that the empress, the literal wife of the emperor, has been spotted at a tavern in the worst part of Rome, working as a prostitute. Not for money, obviously, because what's money when you already control the imperial treasury? For the thrill. Your first reaction would be, that's impossible, someone's spreading fake news. But then more stories start trickling in. Stories about the empress competing with actual professional prostitutes to see who could service more clients in a single night. Stories about her winning those competitions. Real talk. This next part is going to sound absolutely bonkers. But stick with me because multiple ancient historians recorded these events. According to Pliny the Elder, who was definitely not known for sensationalizing stories, Messalina would disguise herself as a common prostitute and work in brothels under the name Lysiska. She didn't do this occasionally. She did it regularly. And she kept detailed records of her activities like she was running a business. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but how is this possible? Wouldn't people recognize the empress? Here's the thing. Most Romans had never actually seen the imperial family up close. There was no television, no photographs, no mass media. If you weren't part of the elite social circles, you might only see the emperor or empress during major public ceremonies, and even then from a distance. But Messalina took this anonymity and turned it into her superpower. She could literally walk among her subjects and do whatever she wanted because they had no idea who she was. And what she wanted was apparently to see just how far she could push the boundaries of acceptable behavior before someone stopped her. Plot twist. Nobody was stopping her. Claudius, meanwhile, was completely oblivious. The man was busy conquering Britain, restructuring the imperial bureaucracy, and dealing with Senate politics. When palace staff tried to hint that perhaps the empress was spending a lot of time away from the palace, Claudius apparently assumed she was involved in some kind of charitable work or religious devotion. Guys, this is like your partner telling you they're going to help out at the community center every night while they're actually competing in underground fight clubs. Except instead of fight clubs, it's ancient Roman brothels, and instead of your average relationship, it's the marriage that literally controls the fate of the civilized world. But here's where things get really wild. The brothel activities were just Messalina warming up. Because while she was exploring the lower depths of Roman society by night, by day she was systematically working to eliminate anyone who might threaten her position or challenge her authority. Remember, this is ancient Rome. Political disagreements weren't settled with strongly worded letters or Twitter feuds. They were settled with poison, assassinations, and strategic executions. Messalina had access to all of these tools, plus the creativity to use them in ways that would make Machiavelli take notes. Anyone who crossed her, anyone who questioned her behavior, anyone who looked at her wrong at a dinner party, had a tendency to suddenly develop fatal illnesses or suffer tragic accidents. And because she was the empress, because she had Claudius's ear, and because she was genuinely intelligent and politically savvy, she could make these eliminations look like coincidences. If you're still with me, you're about to witness the most insane escalation in the history of Imperial Rome. Because Messalina was just getting started, and what she did next makes everything I've told you so far look like a warm-up act. The question everyone in Rome was starting to ask wasn't, what will Messalina do next? It was, is there anything she won't do? Spoiler alert, the answer was no. Buckle up, Buttercup, because this is where our story takes a hard left turn into what the hell did I just read territory. By 42 AD, Messalina had figured out something that most people in power never realize. If you're shameless enough, if you're bold enough, and if you have enough resources, you can basically rewrite the rules of society in real time. And she was about to prove it in the most spectacular way possible. See, all those brothel visits weren't just about personal gratification. They were reconnaissance missions. Messalina was studying power dynamics, learning how people behaved when they thought nobody important was watching, and building a network of contacts throughout every level of Roman society. From senators to slaves, from merchants to gladiators, everyone had seen Lysiska at some point. This gave her something no other Roman empress had ever possessed: street-level intelligence about what was really happening in the empire. While other imperial wives relied on palace gossip and formal reports, Messalina knew which senators were embezzling funds, which merchants were avoiding taxes, which military officers were planning coups, and which aristocrats had embarrassing personal secrets. And she used this information like a weapon. Real talk. What Messalina did next would make modern political operatives weep with envy and terror in equal measure. She started blackmailing half of Rome. Not for money, remember. She already had access to the imperial treasury. She blackmailed people for loyalty, for votes in the Senate, for military appointments, for business contracts. She turned the entire Roman power structure into her personal chess game, and everyone else was just pieces she moved around the board. Drop a comment right now. Have you ever seen anyone use information this strategically? Because what happens next is going to make WikiLeaks look like a school newspaper. But here's where Messalina's genius really shows. She didn't just collect dirt on people, She created situations where important Romans would compromise themselves, then she'd conveniently be there to help them out of their predicaments. In exchange for small favors, of course. Picture this scenario. A wealthy senator is struggling with debts. Mysteriously, a business opportunity appears that could solve all his financial problems. The only catch is that the deal requires him to vote a certain way on some upcoming legislation. The senator takes the deal, votes the way he's supposed to, and his financial problems disappear. 6 months later, that same senator receives a friendly visit from someone representing the Empress. It turns out that business opportunity was arranged by Messalina. The senator isn't in trouble. Oh no, the Empress is just so grateful for his support that she'd like him to consider another small favor. Multiply this scenario by dozens, maybe hundreds of similar situations, and you start to understand how Messalina built what was essentially a shadow government operating parallel to Claudius's official administration. But here's the really wild part. She wasn't content to operate in the shadows. Messalina wanted public recognition for her power, and she was willing to break every single Roman tradition to get it. Roman empresses were supposed to be seen and not heard in public. They could have influence behind the scenes, but they weren't supposed to openly participate in government or make public speeches or attend Senate meetings. Messalina looked at these restrictions and basically said, "Watch me." She started appearing at gladiatorial games not in the Imperial box with Claudius, but down in the arena itself, placing bets and cheering like a common spectator. She attended Senate meetings, not as a silent observer, but as an active participant who questioned senators and offered her own opinions on legislation. Most shocking of all, she started holding her own court sessions in the Imperial palace, where she would hear legal cases and issue binding judgments. Roman law had no provision for empresses to act as judges, but nobody was brave enough to tell the emperor's wife that she couldn't do something. And this is where things get really interesting. Messalina wasn't just breaking rules randomly. She was systematically testing which boundaries she could cross and what the consequences would be. Every transgression was calculated, every scandal was strategic. If you're thinking this sounds like someone planning a coup, congratulations! You're starting to understand what Messalina was really up to. Because all of this, the brothels, the blackmail, the public rule-breaking, the shadow government, wasn't an end in itself. It was preparation for something much bigger. Messalina wasn't just trying to be the most powerful empress in Roman history. She was trying to become the most powerful person in the Roman Empire, period. And she came a lot closer to succeeding than anyone realized, until it was almost too late. All right, folks, what if I told you that everything I've described so far was just Messalina getting warmed up? Because what she did in 48 AD makes everything else look like amateur hour, and it nearly brought down the entire Roman government. But first, we need to talk about the one person in Rome who actually understood what Messalina was doing and decided to do something about it. Enter Narcissus, Claudius's secretary and one of the most powerful freed slaves in Roman history. Now, when I say secretary, don't picture someone taking dictation and filing paperwork. In the Roman imperial system, the emperor's personal secretary was basically the chief of staff, intelligence director, and gatekeeper all rolled into one. Narcissus controlled access to Claudius, managed imperial correspondence, and knew every single thing that happened in the palace, which meant he knew exactly what Messalina was up to. For years, Narcissus had been watching Messalina's activities with growing alarm. He'd seen her build her shadow network, witnessed her blackmail operations, and observed her systematic destruction of traditional Roman norms. But he also understood something crucial about palace politics. You don't move against the Empress unless you're absolutely certain you can win. Because if you try to take down someone with that much power and you fail, you don't just lose your job. You lose your life. So Narcissus waited and watched and collected evidence. He was building a case against Messalina that would be so overwhelming, so undeniable, that even Claudius wouldn't be able to ignore it. Meanwhile, Messalina was getting bored with just being the power behind the throne. She wanted more. She wanted everything. And this is where our story takes the most insane turn you can possibly imagine. Hold up. Before we continue, Pause the video and try to guess what someone who already had unlimited power, unlimited wealth, and unlimited access would do if they decided that still wasn't enough. I guarantee whatever you're thinking isn't crazy enough. In 48 AD, while Claudius was away from Rome on official business, Messalina did something so outrageous, so unprecedented, so completely insane that when news of it reached the emperor, he literally didn't believe it at first. She got married, again, while still married to Claudius. But not just to anyone. She married Gaius Silius, who was not only one of the most handsome and powerful men in Rome, but also one of the richest. And they didn't have some secret ceremony in a private villa. They had a full public wedding with all the traditional Roman ceremonies, complete with witnesses, contracts, and legal documentation. Guys, this wasn't just adultery. This wasn't even just bigamy. Under Roman law, this was treason, because by marrying Silius, while still married to the emperor, Messalina was essentially declaring that Silius was the new emperor. Real talk. This is like the First Lady announcing she's married the Secretary of Defense, and they're moving into the White House while the president is on a business trip overseas. Except in ancient Rome, the penalty for this wasn't impeachment and public embarrassment. The penalty was death for everyone involved. But here's what makes this story even more unbelievable. Messalina didn't try to hide what she'd done. She celebrated it. She threw parties. She appeared in public with Silius, acting like newlyweds, while still technically being the Empress of Rome. The entire city was in chaos. Senators didn't know whether to recognize Silius as the new emperor or wait for Claudius to return. Military commanders were confused about whose orders to follow. Citizens were literally standing in the streets asking each other, "Is this legal? Can she do this? What happens now?" And this is where Narcissus made his move. He sent urgent messages to Claudius, who was in Ostia dealing with port administrative issues, basically telling him, "Sir, you need to get back to Rome immediately because your wife has just committed treason in the most public way possible." Claudius's first reaction was to assume this was some kind of misunderstanding or exaggeration. Messalina had been pushing boundaries for years, but surely even she wouldn't be crazy enough to get married to someone else while still married to the emperor. Then he got the official documentation, marriage contracts with Messalina's signature, witness statements from dozens of prominent Romans who attended the ceremony, physical evidence that his wife had legally married another man. If you're still with me, you're about to witness what happens when someone finally pushes too far, and the consequences are going to be absolutely devastating. Because Messalina had just made the one mistake she couldn't blackmail her way out of, couldn't manipulate her way around, and couldn't use her network of contacts to solve. She had forgotten that ultimate power still has limits, and she was about to discover what those limits were. Plot twist incoming. The woman who had spent years manipulating everyone around her was about to discover that she'd been outmaneuvered by someone who understood Roman politics better than she did. When Claudius received Narcissus's messages about Messalina's marriage to Silius, his first instinct wasn't rage, it was disbelief. Because even for Messalina, even after years of increasingly outrageous behavior, this seemed impossible. But Narcissus had been preparing for this moment for years. He didn't just send word about the marriage. He sent proof. Documentation, witness statements, and most damning of all, reports from his own intelligence network showing that Messalina and Silius were already making plans to eliminate Claudius and take over the empire officially. This wasn't just adultery or even bigamy. This was a coup attempt disguised as a wedding. Real talk. What Narcissus revealed to Claudius would make modern conspiracy theorists feel like they weren't thinking big enough. Messalina hadn't just married Silius on impulse or for love. She'd been planning this takeover for months, possibly years. The brothel visits? They weren't just for personal gratification. They were intelligence-gathering operations where she recruited contacts throughout every level of Roman society. The blackmail network? That wasn't just about accumulating power for its own sake. It was about identifying who would support a regime change and who would need to be eliminated. The public rule-breaking and boundary crossing? That was conditioning Roman society to accept that traditional limits didn't apply to her, so that when she made her final move, it would seem like a natural progression rather than a shocking betrayal. Every single thing Messalina had done as empress had been preparation for this moment. But here's where her plan had a fatal flaw. She'd underestimated Narcissus. While she'd been building her shadow network and preparing her coup, Narcissus had been building his own intelligence operation. He'd been tracking her activities, documenting her conspiracies, and identifying everyone in her network. When she finally made her move, he was ready. Drop a comment right now. Have you ever seen someone plan something this elaborate only to have it completely backfire? Because what happens next is going to be an absolute masterclass in political maneuvering. Claudius, once he understood the full scope of what was happening, didn't panic. Remember, this is the man who'd conquered Britain and reformed the entire imperial bureaucracy. When he needed to, he could be absolutely ruthless. But he also understood something crucial about Roman politics. You can't just execute the empress and expect everything to go back to normal. Messalina had too many connections, too much influence, and too many people who depended on her network. If he moved against her carelessly, he could trigger a civil war. So instead of rushing back to Rome and confronting Messalina directly, Claudius did something brilliant. He used her own methods against her. While Messalina was celebrating her marriage to Silius and making plans for their new government, Claudius and Narcissus were systematically dismantling her entire operation. They identified every person in her network, every blackmail victim, every conspirator, and every supporter. Then they gave all of these people a choice: abandon Messalina immediately and face no consequences, or continue supporting her and face execution for treason. Guess how many people chose to stay loyal to Messalina when they realized the emperor was back in control? If you guessed basically nobody, you understand Roman politics. Within hours of Claudius's return to Rome, Messalina's entire network collapsed. The senators she'd been blackmailing suddenly remembered their loyalty to the emperor. The military officers she'd cultivated decided their careers were more important than their personal relationships. The merchants and aristocrats who'd been part of her operation discovered urgent business that required them to leave the city immediately. And Silius, the man she'd married in her grand gesture of defiance, he was arrested before he even realized what was happening. But here's the most incredible part of this story. Even when everything was falling apart around her, even when her network was abandoning her and her co-conspirators were being arrested, Messalina still thought she could talk her way out of it. Because for years, that's exactly what she'd been doing. Every time she'd pushed too far, every time she'd broken another rule, every time someone had tried to call her out, she'd managed to manipulate the situation and emerge stronger than before. She had no idea that this time was different. This time, she'd finally met someone who was better at the game than she was. And Claudius was about to show her exactly what happened to people who tried to overthrow the Roman Empire. Buckle up, because this is where our story reaches its absolutely devastating conclusion, and it's going to be more brutal than anything you've seen in Game of Thrones. So picture this: Messalina, who has spent years believing she's untouchable, suddenly realizes that her entire world is collapsing. Her network has abandoned her, her co-conspirators are being arrested, and the husband she thought was a harmless scholar has just revealed himself to be a political mastermind who's been playing chess while she was playing checkers. But even now, even with everything falling apart, Messalina refused to accept that she'd lost. When word reached her that Claudius was back in Rome and arresting her supporters, her first instinct wasn't to flee or hide or beg for mercy. It was to double down. Because in her mind, she still had one trump card left: their children. Messalina grabbed Britannicus and Octavia and rushed to meet Claudius, apparently believing that if she showed up with his children, appealed to his parental instincts, and played the role of the repentant wife, she could somehow manipulate her way out of a treason charge. Guys, this woman had literally married another man while still married to the emperor, publicly celebrated that marriage, and was caught planning a coup, and she still thought she could charm her way back into power. That takes a level of confidence that borders on delusion. Real talk. This next part is going to sound absolutely bonkers, but according to multiple historical sources, when Messalina arrived to confront Claudius, she actually tried to seduce him. Right there, in front of their children, in front of the Praetorian Guard, in front of government officials, she attempted to use the same sexual manipulation that had worked for her so many times before. It didn't work. Claudius looked at the woman who had been his wife for nearly a decade, who had given him children, who had shared his bed and his power, and he saw not the person he'd loved but a traitor who had been planning to kill him and steal his throne. And this is where Claudius revealed just how completely he'd learned to play the game of Roman politics. He didn't have an emotional breakdown. He didn't rage or weep or make dramatic speeches about betrayal. He simply looked at Messalina and said, in essence, "You are no longer my wife. You are no longer empress. You are a traitor to Rome, and traitors are executed." Then he turned to Narcissus and gave him the authority to handle the situation as he saw fit. Hold up. Before we continue, drop a comment if you think there's any way this story could have ended differently, because what happens next is going to make you realize that Messalina had sealed her own fate years earlier. Narcissus didn't waste time with trials or formal proceedings. Under Roman law, treason was punishable by immediate execution, and the evidence against Messalina was overwhelming. More importantly, keeping her alive meant risking that she might somehow rebuild her network or find new allies willing to support another coup attempt. But here's the most chilling part of this entire story. When the Praetorian Guards came to arrest Messalina, she still didn't understand that this was really happening. According to Tacitus, one of our best sources for this period, she kept insisting that there had been some mistake, that Claudius would change his mind, that surely they weren't really going to execute the mother of his children. Even as they were leading her away, she was still trying to negotiate, still trying to manipulate, still believing that she could find some angle, some leverage, some way to turn this situation to her advantage. She couldn't accept that for the first time in her adult life, she had encountered a situation where her intelligence, her sexuality, her network, and her manipulation skills were completely useless. The execution was carried out immediately. No trial, no public spectacle, no dramatic final speech. Messalina, the woman who had shocked Rome with her audacity and nearly succeeded in overthrowing the empire, died the same way most Roman traitors died, quietly, efficiently, and permanently. But here's what makes this ending even more brutal. Claudius didn't just execute Messalina. He systematically erased her from Roman history. Her name was removed from public monuments, her images were destroyed, and official records were altered to minimize references to her existence. In the Roman world, this was worse than death. This was damnatio memoriae, the complete obliteration of a person's legacy. It was as if the empire was saying, this person never existed, and their actions never happened. Except, of course, that's not how history works. Because what Messalina did was so shocking, so unprecedented, and so politically significant that historians couldn't ignore it, even when the official records tried to make her disappear. And that's why we know her story today. Not because Rome wanted to remember her, but because what she did was so extraordinary that forgetting it was impossible. What do you think? Was Messalina a criminal mastermind, a victim of her own ambition, or something else entirely? Let me know below, because we need to talk about what this story actually means and why it matters today. See, it would be easy to dismiss Messalina as just another example of how absolute power corrupts absolutely, but that completely misses what makes her story so significant and so terrifying. Messalina wasn't corrupted by power. She understood power better than almost anyone in Roman history. Every single thing she did, from the brothel visits to the blackmail networks to the final coup attempt, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how political systems actually work versus how they're supposed to work. She figured out that if you're willing to break enough social norms, if you're smart enough to build the right networks, and if you're bold enough to take risks that other people won't take, you can accumulate power far beyond what your official position should allow. And for almost a decade, it worked perfectly. Real talk. If Messalina had been just slightly more patient, if she'd waited until Claudius died naturally, instead of trying to accelerate the timeline with her marriage to Silius, she might have actually succeeded in creating a new model for imperial power. Think about it. She had already proven that an empress could openly participate in government, could build independent power networks, and could operate outside traditional gender roles without triggering a revolution. If she'd consolidated those gains instead of pushing for total control, she might have permanently changed what it meant to be a Roman empress. But here's the really scary part of this story. Messalina's methods didn't die with her. The techniques she pioneered for building shadow networks, manipulating information, and using personal relationships for political gain became standard tools in Roman imperial politics. Future empresses and emperors studied what she'd done, learned from her mistakes, and refined her methods. The Roman Empire became more paranoid, more surveillance-heavy, and more focused on controlling information, specifically because Messalina had shown how dangerous it could be when someone built parallel power structures. Drop a comment right now. Do any of Messalina's tactics sound familiar when you think about modern politics? Because the parallels are going to make you seriously uncomfortable. Building networks of people who owe you favors? Every modern politician does this. Using private information about opponents to influence their behavior? That's called opposition research today. Systematically breaking social norms to expand your power? Welcome to the last decade of global politics. The main difference between Messalina and modern political operators is that she was doing it 2,000 years ago without mass media, without digital surveillance, and without modern communications technology. She built her entire operation through personal relationships and face-to-face intelligence gathering, which means she was probably more skilled at political manipulation than most people operating today with all our modern advantages. But here's the most important lesson from Messalina's story. She ultimately failed, not because her methods were wrong, but because she forgot that even unconventional power has limits. She became so confident in her ability to manipulate situations that she stopped calculating risks properly. The marriage to Silius wasn't just a strategic mistake, it was a fundamental misunderstanding of Roman political psychology. Romans could accept an empress who broke social norms, who accumulated unusual power, and who operated outside traditional boundaries. But they couldn't accept an empress who openly rejected the basic legal framework that held the empire together. By marrying Silius while still married to Claudius, Messalina crossed the line from being an unconventional empress to being an existential threat to Roman law itself. And once she became that kind of threat, even her most powerful allies had to abandon her to protect themselves. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more crazy stuff in Roman imperial history that schools never teach you. Messalina's story connects to larger patterns about how empires handle internal threats, how gender roles evolve under political pressure, and how individual ambition can destabilize entire civilizations. If you want to hear more stories like this about people who nearly changed the course of